He told the board I was a glorified bookie. My treaties covered $4.7 billion in catastrophe risk no one else on Earth would touch. That's the phrase Graham Faulkner used. 28 years old, 12 months of work experience selling weather alerts to homeowners. And he looked at 17 years of catastrophe treaty architecture, placements that kept 40 primary insurers solvent through the worst hurricane seasons in modern history, and called it bookmaking. I didn't hear him say it. He typed it. Late at night, from his phone, in an email he thought was going to 6 people. It went to 7. But I'll get to that. My name is Malcolm Irwin. I'm 51 years old. I spent 17 years as Senior Vice President of Treaty Reinsurance at Cornerstone Re in Stamford, Connecticut. Before that, I spent 11 years in the United States Army as a Financial Management Officer, MOS 36A. I was commissioned through ROTC at Yukon, entered as a second lieutenant, served at Fort Bragg, completed 2 deployments managing theater-level financial operations in Southwest Asia, and exited the Army at the rank of major. In the Army, a miscalculation in operational cost forecasting didn't mean someone filed an amendment. It meant a logistics convoy ran out of fuel 80 miles from the wire with no air cover and no contingency. You learn to be precise. You learn that precision isn't a personality trait. It's a survival mechanism. And you learn that the people who talk the most about data are usually the ones who've never had to live inside the consequences of getting a number wrong. I joined Cornerstone Re in January 2007 because reinsurance was the only civilian field where that kind of precision carried the same weight it did in theater. Catastrophe treaty reinsurance isn't insurance. It's the insurance behind the insurance. The layer that absorbs the losses when a Category 4 hurricane hits landfall and $9 billion in insured property is underwater before sunrise. The primary insurers, the companies whose names you actually know, they can't hold that kind of exposure on their own balance sheets. They cede it. They transfer the tail risk to reinsurers who have the capital and the appetite to carry it. And the way that capacity gets placed, at least in the catastrophe excess of loss market, is not through algorithms. It's not through platforms. It's through people. Specifically, it's through Lloyd's of London, where syndicate leads. Individual underwriters with broad discretion over billions in capacity decide who they trust enough to write business with. They don't evaluate companies. They evaluate judgment. They want to know, when a hurricane is 72 hours from landfall and the models are diverging, who is the person on the other end of the phone? And has that person been right before? I was that person for 14 years. When I arrived at Cornerstone, the catastrophe treaty book was $400 million in aggregate limit, respectable for a specialty shop, but nothing that moved the needle at Lloyd's. I built it to $4.7 billion, not by selling, not by pitching, by being right. I built a catastrophe aggregation model in 2009, sketched the original correlation matrix on a legal pad during a 4-hour train delay at Penn Station, the framework for how overlapping perils in adjacent basins compound exposure in ways the standard vendor models undercount. I laminated that page, taped it to the wall above my monitor. It's been at every desk I've occupied since. The laminate has cracked twice and been redone. The pencil lines have faded. Nobody at Cornerstone ever asked me what it was, Philip Ashworth asked. He's the lead underwriter at one of the 3 Lloyd's syndicates that placed catastrophe capacity exclusively through me starting in 2011. He asked at a Lloyd's annual dinner, the kind of event where most people are working the room, and Philip was sitting at my table actually listening. I explained the matrix for 20 minutes. He didn't interrupt once. That was the year his syndicate doubled its capacity commitment through Cornerstone. Philip and the other 2 syndicate leads never submitted a catastrophe quote to any other entity at Cornerstone, not because of a contract. There was no contract between the syndicates and Cornerstone Re. there was a handshake between the syndicates and me. 14 years of me being right within 3% of actual on every major catastrophe event since 2012. 14 years of hand-delivered apology, letters after bad loss years, congratulatory notes after good ones, dinners where I knew the names of their wives and asked about their children by name. 14 years of trust that could not be assigned, transferred, or uploaded to a dashboard. Cornerstone traded depth of relationship for breadth of panel. That was my choice, and it maximized capacity terms for 17 years. It also meant there was zero redundancy. The entire $4.7 billion in catastrophe aggregate limit flowed through 3 relationships, and all 3 of those relationships lived in my phone. Not on a company server, in my phone. That's what Graham Faulkner called bookmaking. Here's what it cost me. August 2019. Hurricane Dorian. I was tracking the projected landfall path against $340 million in aggregate limit concentrated in the Bahamas Basin. The models were splitting. The European model had it curving north. The American model had it stalling over Grand Bahama for 36 hours. The difference between those 2 tracks was the difference between a manageable loss and a portfolio-threatening event for 2 of my 3 syndicate partners. I was on the phone with Philip Ashworth's desk in London at 6 a.m., running scenario analyses, when Connor's travel team played the regional finals. Connor is my son. He's 17 now. He was 12 then. Left-handed pitcher, strong arm, the kind of kid coaches notice early. His mother, Rebecca, we'd been divorced 4 years by then, clean settlement, no drama, she was in the bleachers. I was on a conference call in my home office, watching radar imagery of a Category 5 hurricane. Connor sent me a photo of the trophy after. The team won. He's grinning in the photo, holding the trophy with both hands, dirt on his jersey. I printed it at a CVS the next day. It's been in my wallet ever since. Not framed, not displayed, just folded once. Creased along the middle, tucked behind my driver's license. I didn't frame it, because framing it would have felt like I'd earned the right to celebrate. I hadn't been there. I've made it to exactly 2 of Connor's games in 3 seasons, both during stretches when the catastrophe calendar was quiet enough to breathe. Every other game, I was on the phone, or on a plane, or in a conference room, staring at a correlation matrix while my kid threw fastballs I never saw. That's the math of this job. You give it 17 years, and it takes your marriage, your weekends, and most of the moments you can't get back. And the company deposits your salary and assumes you'll keep showing up because you've got a mortgage and a kid and no algorithm you can sell somewhere else. If you've ever had someone with 12 months of experience tell you that everything you built is outdated, hit that like button and subscribe. This one's just getting started. Graham Faulkner arrived in June 2024. Richard Faulkner, Cornerstone's CEO, 61, founding shareholder, announced it in a company-wide email with the subject line, "A New Chapter." Graham was Richard's nephew. His mother was Richard's sister. The title was Chief Innovation Officer, a position that did not exist before Graham needed it. There was no board vote, no external candidate search, just the email, and then a white Tesla Model S pulling into the reserved lot with the dealer plate frame still on it. Weatherstream Chevrolet, 9th Avenue, Manhattan. Graham wore slim-fit suits in charcoal or navy with no tie. He considered ties a signal of deference. He carried an iPad everywhere, running a live data dashboard he referenced constantly during meetings, but could not explain the underlying methodology of when anyone asked a follow-up question. He wore his Columbia MBA ring on his right hand, turned inward during meetings, like a tell he didn't know he had. He spoke about 15% too loudly in quiet rooms, and he announced his arrival with a LinkedIn post about day 1 of building the world's first AI-native reinsurance platform. He did not attend my Thursday modeling review. He sent an assistant to take notes. By October, Graham presented Project Clarity to the board, A plan to replace relationship-based placement with what he called algorithmic capacity sourcing. The deck was 47 slides. I was mentioned once in a footnote on slide 31. Legacy infrastructure scheduled for transition. I didn't see the deck in October. I saw something worse in November. November 19th, a Tuesday. Janet Cooper, my executive assistant for 11 years, a woman who knew where every file lived, who every client was, and which Lloyd's partners drank scotch versus wine at the annual market dinner. Janet left a plain envelope on the passenger seat of my Volvo in the parking garage. No note. Just the envelope. Inside was a printed email thread. Graham had sent it at 11:47 p.m. to a strategy planning group that included Richard Faulkner. He sent it from his phone. He didn't notice that Janet's assistant address was on the planning group alias. The email read, "Malcolm is a glorified bookie who thinks handshakes are a strategy." And then, further down, "We need to get this company out of the relationship business and into the data business. People like Malcolm are expensive nostalgia. The algorithm doesn't need a company card or 14 years of Christmas cards." And the line that told me everything I needed to know about what was coming. Malcolm's been here 17 years. He's got a mortgage, a kid, and no algorithm he can sell somewhere else. He'll negotiate down. They always do. I read it in the parking lot of a diner in Fairfield. Rain was coming down on the windshield. Engine running, heater on, the wipers going every few seconds. I read it twice. I almost laughed. Then I didn't. I called Wade Bancroft. Wade and I served overlapping tours at Fort Bragg. He was JAG. I was finance. And we'd been close since 2001. He's a partner now at a financial services litigation firm in Hartford. He'd reviewed my Cornerstone employment agreement when I signed it in 2007 and knew every line of it. "Wade," I said, "I need you to pull my contract. Specifically Article 5, Section 9.3, B. The IP assignment language." He called me back in 40 minutes. "The relationships aren't on any server they own, Malcolm. The syndicates don't have a contract with Cornerstone. They have a handshake with you. That's not intellectual property. That's your name." He also confirmed what I already knew. My non-compete was limited to U.S. domestic markets for 12 months. It said nothing about Bermuda-based reinsurance operations. "How bad is this going to get for them?" Wade asked. "Depends on when they figure it out." 3 days later, they fired me. November 22nd, the 14th floor conference room, the fishbowl we called it, because the exterior wall was floor-to-ceiling glass facing Long Island Sound. I'd presented every treaty renewal in that room since 2011. Cold rain was driving against the windows, the kind that turns the Connecticut shoreline gray for days. Graham sat across from me. To his left was an HR associate named Allison Wright, who gripped the back of the empty chair beside her with both hands and stared at the edge of the table, like it contained instructions for surviving the next 10 minutes. Graham used the phrases strategic restructuring, digital transformation, and right-sizing relationship dependency. He spoke slightly too loudly, the way he always did. The iPad was on the table in front of him, dashboard running, as if the data might validate what he was doing. The exchange took 11 minutes. "I understand," I said. "Send my exit paperwork to the address on file." I stood up. I walked to the wall where my laminated matrix had hung for the last 6 years in that room. The original correlation framework. Pencil on legal pad. Penn Station. 2009. I peeled the tape carefully. I folded the page once and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I shook Graham's hand. He was surprised by the handshake. I could feel it in his grip, loose, uncertain, like he'd rehearsed the speech, but not the ending. I walked out of the fishbowl, down the corridor, past Janet's desk. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. I took the elevator to the garage. I got into my Volvo, 2015 S60, dark gray, 194,000 miles. Floor mats replaced twice. Nothing wrong with it. And I sat there for a while with the engine off, listening to the rain hit the concrete above me. Then I drove to Westport. I drove to the pier, Campo Beach, and to the public fishing dock, the concrete bench that's been mine since my second month at Cornerstone. November 22nd, 34 degrees, wind coming off the Sound hard enough to cut through my jacket. I sat down. The bench was wet. I didn't care. I sat there for 40 minutes. I did not call Wade. I did not call Rebecca. I did not call Connor. He'd hear about it when I was ready, and not from a version of me still processing. I did not call the 2 reinsurance brokers whose numbers had already lit up my phone within 3 hours of the news hitting the market grapevine. Reinsurance is a small world. Word travels through Lloyd's coffee rooms and Bermuda lunch tables faster than it travels through email. 2 brokers called before I'd reached exit 18 on I-95. I let both go to voicemail. I did not update LinkedIn. I sat on that bench and watched the Sound. The water was the color of pencil lead, flat, gray, no light in it. A single sailboat was moored about 200 yards out, hull rocking in the chop. Nobody aboard. I thought about the January 1st renewal. I thought about what Philip Ashworth's desk would do when Cornerstone's placement team called to submit without my name on the cover note. I thought about it the way I used to think about convoy logistics in theater. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with the cold clarity of someone who understands what happens when you remove a load-bearing wall and expect the roof to hold. Then I went home, made dinner, and didn't mention any of it to Connor when he came over Friday evening. He asked why I was home early. I told him I had some schedule changes. He said, "Cool. You coming to the scrimmage Saturday?" I said I'd be there. I was there. That was the last thing Graham Faulkner's restructuring plan gave me before it took everything from the people who wrote it. The weeks between November 22nd and December 27th were quiet on my end. Perfectly quiet. I went to Connor's scrimmage. I drove to the pier 3 more times. I read 2 books I'd been meaning to read for 4 years. I had my Volvo's oil changed. 197,000 miles now. Still running without complaint. Still the highest safety rating in its class the year I bought it used from a dealer in Norwalk. I did not reach out to Philip Ashworth. I did not reach out to the other 2 syndicate leads. I did not need to. 14 years is 14 years. They knew where I was. They knew what had happened. The Lloyd's market is small enough that Graham's LinkedIn post about exciting transitions in our leadership model was being discussed in the Lloyd's coffee room before the American markets opened the next morning. Philip Ashworth would have read it, set down his tea, and said nothing. That's how Philip operates. He processes. Then he acts. I trusted the process the way I'd trusted it since 2011. The capacity would go where the judgment went. That wasn't arrogance. That was how the catastrophe market works. During those same weeks, Graham's team was working the phones. I know this because the reinsurance broker community is approximately the size of a large dinner party, and 3 separate brokers mentioned it to me unprompted. 2 at a holiday reception I attended in Norwalk, 1 via text. Cornerstone's placement team was calling London. They were calling Bermuda. They were calling Zurich. They were trying to find alternative capacity for a $4.7 billion catastrophe book with a January 1st renewal date that was 5 weeks away and closing fast. Nobody would quote. Not because the book was bad. The book was excellent. I'd built it that way over 17 years. But catastrophe excess of loss capacity at the Lloyd's level isn't a commodity you source on a platform. It's a commitment made by individual underwriters who stake their syndicate's capital on the judgment of the person presenting the risk. And the person presenting the risk was sitting on a concrete bench in Westport, Connecticut, watching the tide go out. Graham's team didn't understand this. They'd never had to. The capacity had always been there on January 1st, like electricity. You flip the switch and it works. Nobody on Graham's team had ever stood in a Lloyd's box at 3 a.m. London time during a live hurricane event and talked a syndicate lead through the real-time aggregation numbers while the models were still diverging. Nobody on his team had Philip Ashworth's mobile number. Nobody on his team had ever received a handwritten note from a syndicate lead after a bad loss year that said simply, "Noted. We'll adjust and continue." PA. The switch didn't flip. December 27th. I was in my condo. Freezing drizzle outside, sleet streaking the windows, the kind of weather that makes the Connecticut coast feel like it's being slowly erased. Lights off. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. Connor was with Rebecca for the holiday week. The condo was quiet. My phone rang at 11:04 a.m., London number. I knew who it was before I looked. Philip Ashworth did not start with pleasantries. "We won't quote to Cornerstone at renewal, Malcolm. You know why. I expect you'll be somewhere worth writing capacity for within 60 days. Call me when you're settled." 4 minutes. The entire call lasted 4 minutes. Philip said what he'd come to say. I said, "I will. Thank you, Philip." And that was it. I sat with the phone on the table for a moment. Then I opened my laptop and drafted an email to the CEO of Pinnacle Re in Hamilton, Bermuda. 1 paragraph. 3 sentences. I attached nothing. My track record was the attachment. I closed the laptop. I put on my coat and drove to the pier. The sleet had turned to a fine, cold rain by the time I sat down on the bench. My phone was in my jacket pocket. I could feel it against my chest. It did not ring for the next hour. It was the last quiet hour it would have for a while. December 28th. The first call from Graham Faulkner came at 9:17 a.m. I was in my kitchen making eggs. His name on my screen. I watched it ring, watched it go to voicemail. He didn't leave one. He called again at 2:30 p.m. Again at 5:15. I was at the grocery store for the third one, standing in the cereal aisle, holding a box of Cheerios, while the phone buzzed in my pocket. I put the Cheerios in the cart. December 29th. 2 more calls. December 30th. 3. New Year's Eve. 2. 1 at 10 a.m. 1 at 11:47 p.m. I was on the couch watching the ball drop with a cup of tea when the late one came in. Connor was asleep in the guest room. The phone lit up on the coffee table. Graham Faulkner. I let it pulse against the wood until it stopped. Connor's door was closed. The apartment was warm. The sleet had finally stopped. 14 calls over 6 days. I returned none of them. I knew what was happening inside Cornerstone because I'd spent 17 years knowing exactly how that building worked. I could map it in my sleep. The placement team would have escalated to Graham by December 28th. The day after Philip's call reached Cornerstone's desk through the formal channel, a polite 1-paragraph notification that the syndicate would not be submitting renewal terms. The other 2 syndicates sent identical notifications within 48 hours. 3 letters. 3 paragraphs. No capacity. Graham would have told the placement team to find alternatives. The placement team would have spent the next 5 days calling every Lloyd's syndicate, every Bermuda carrier, every continental European reinsurer with catastrophe appetite. They would have heard the same thing from every one of them. Not at this size. Not at these terms. Not without a treaty lead whose track record we can underwrite. One of the brokers told me later that a Zurich-based carrier's response was 4 words. Where did Irwin go? January 1st came and went. The renewal date, the single most important date on the property catastrophe calendar worldwide, passed with $4.7 billion in aggregate limits sitting unplaced. 40 primary insurer clients entered the new year without catastrophe coverage from Cornerstone Re. Not reduced coverage. No coverage. The product they were paying for simply ceased to exist. January 3rd. 8:47 a.m. Marcus Reed walked into Graham's office holding one sheet of paper. Marcus is Cornerstone's CFO, 44, 4 kids, not a villain, not a hero. Just the first person in the building who could do the math fast enough to understand what the math meant. He'd been at his desk since 6:30, reading the formal, non-renewal notices from all 3 syndicates, checking them against the aggregate limits, cross-referencing with the client exposure reports. He did the calculation in his head. He didn't need a spreadsheet. The number was simple enough to be devastating. He stood in Graham's doorway. Graham was at his desk, the iPad open to his dashboard, a cold coffee in a paper cup next to his keyboard. "We have a situation," Marcus said. He explained it in terms Graham should have already understood, but clearly didn't. All 3 syndicates, no capacity, no alternative market willing to write the book on comparable terms before Q2 at the earliest. And Q2 was meaningless because the clients needed coverage now, in January, for hurricane season planning that starts in March. 40 clients with catastrophe programs that were suddenly hollow. Graham's first response was to ask whether they could sue the syndicates for breach. Marcus took a breath. There was no contract to breach. The syndicates had never signed a binding capacity agreement with Cornerstone Ray. They had submitted renewal quotes annually, at their sole discretion, to a person they trusted. That person was gone. The discretion remained. The quotes did not. Marcus explained this the way you explain physics to someone who thinks they can negotiate with gravity. Graham called Richard Faulkner. I don't know exactly what was said, but I know the call lasted 9 minutes. One of the brokers heard about it from someone on Cornerstone's floor who watched Graham through the glass wall of his office, pacing, one hand on the back of his neck, the iPad forgotten on the desk. The thing Graham had written about expensive nostalgia, the thing about handshakes not being a strategy, the thing about Christmas cards and company credit cards and algorithms that don't need any of it. He was learning what all of it actually meant. By January 7th, the client terminations began. Not angry calls, not threats, just quiet, professional notifications from compliance departments at 31 of 40 primary insurers, informing Cornerstone Re that they would be seeking catastrophe coverage through alternative placements. The coverage they'd purchased didn't exist. They needed it to exist somewhere. Several of them called me directly, not to negotiate, not to complain, just to ask, in the careful language of people who manage regulated balance sheets, where I was planning to land. I told them I'd be in touch soon. January 15th, I signed my offer from Pinnacle Re. Chief Treaty Officer, Hamilton, Bermuda. The compensation package alone was more money than Graham Faulkner had described as expensive nostalgia. By a factor I'll let you calculate. My phone rang that evening. Not Graham, not Richard, Connor. Dad, Mom said something happened at your work. Something happened. Good something or bad something? I looked out the window of my condo. The sleet had come back. The sound was invisible in the dark. Both, I said. I'll tell you about it this weekend. You've been at that pier again? He said. That bad? That good, actually. This time. He was quiet for a second. Then, okay, bring food when you come Saturday. Mom's fridge is, I know what her fridge is. I'll bring food. The next morning, my phone rang at 7:12 a.m. Graham Faulkner. I was standing at the kitchen counter, pouring coffee into a travel mug, about to drive to the pier one more time. I watched the screen light up, watched his name pulse, counted to 4. Then I set the phone face down on the counter, picked up my coffee, and walked out the door. January 20th. Pinnacle Re released the announcement. 3 sentences. My name, my title, the effective date. No adjectives. No vision statement. No photograph of me shaking hands with anyone in a lobby. The industry trades ran it as a lead item within the hour. I know the exact moment Graham read it because Marcus Reed told me later. Months later, after Cornerstone had been sold, and Marcus had landed at a carrier in Hartford and could finally talk about it without a non-disclosure agreement pressing on his windpipe. Marcus said Graham was standing in the Cornerstone lobby at 8:40 a.m., scrolling his phone, holding a cold coffee he'd been carrying since the elevator. The Tesla was parked outside. Graham read the 3 sentences, and his thumb stopped moving. He stood there for a full 10 seconds, the lobby foot traffic parting around him like water around a piling. Then he walked back to the elevator without saying a word to anyone. That same morning, Philip Ashworth emailed me. Not my Gmail. The new Pinnacle readdress that had been activated 12 hours earlier. 2 lines. Received your new coordinates. Renewal terms to follow by end of week. PA. The capacity was back before I'd unpacked my desk. Late January. Richard Faulkner called me. I was at the Campo Beach Pier. It was 28 degrees. The sound was flat and colorless, the way it gets in deep winter when even the waves seem tired. I saw the number come in. Richard's personal cell, a number I'd had for 17 years and had called maybe 4 times. I answered. Richard didn't waste time. He never had. That was the one trait his nephew hadn't inherited. He asked if there was anything that could bring the capacity back to Cornerstone. He asked it the way a man asks a doctor about a prognosis he already suspects. The syndicates didn't do business with Cornerstone Re, I said. They did business with me. I'm still here. Silence on the line. 3 seconds. 4. Does that mean you'd consider coming back? He asked. It means you'll know where to find me. I hung up. I put the phone in my coat pocket. The wind off the sound was sharp enough to make my eyes water, or maybe it wasn't the wind. I sat there for another 10 minutes, watching a cormorant work the shallows near the pilings. Then I drove home. That was the last conversation I had with anyone at Cornerstone RIA, February 3rd. Cornerstone filed an 8K with the SEC disclosing the non-renewal of its Catastrophe Treaty program. The language was clinical. Material adverse development in reinsurance capacity placement, but the analyst community didn't need poetry. They needed the number, and the number was $4.7 billion in aggregate limit. Gone. Not reduced, not renegotiated. Gone. The stock opened down 12%. By 10:30 a.m., it was down 27%. By the close of trading, it had fallen 44% on volume that was 9 times the 90-day average. 44% in a single session. The floor fell out the way it does when the market realizes that a company's core product no longer exists, and the person who made it exist is now building it somewhere else. I watched the ticker that afternoon on my laptop in my condo. The screen was the same flat gray as the overcast sky that had been sitting on the Connecticut coast for a week straight. I felt nothing triumphant. I felt the specific, narrow sadness of watching something you built for 17 years come apart because someone with 12 months of experience decided that handshakes were a rounding error. Then I closed the laptop and started packing for Bermuda. The rot was already structural by then, but the specifics took months to fully surface, and each one was worse than the last. February through March. Cornerstone's placement team made 94 outbound calls to alternative capacity providers. I know the number because it appeared in a board presentation that was later referenced in the acquisition due diligence materials. 94 calls, 11 responses, 0 binding commitments. The catastrophe reinsurance market does not hand over billions in capacity to a team that has never managed a live event, never sat across from a syndicate lead during a $300 million loss notification, never earned the trust that makes an underwriter commit capital against the possibility that nature will do what nature does. 94 calls, 0 capacity. April. The Connecticut Department of Insurance opened a preliminary inquiry into Cornerstone's ability to meet its existing treaty obligations to policyholders. The inquiry was procedural, standard when a regulated entity experiences what the filing called a material reduction in reinsurance support. But procedural inquiries generate legal costs, board anxiety, and headlines in trade publications. Cornerstone retained outside counsel. The legal fees for Q2 alone exceeded $1.4 million. May. The first of 3 class action shareholder lawsuits was filed in the Southern District of New York. The complaint alleged that Cornerstone's board had failed to disclose the concentration risk inherent in a capacity program that depended on a single employee's personal relationships, and that the creation of the Chief Innovation Officer role and the subsequent termination of that employee constituted a breach of fiduciary duty to shareholders. The lead plaintiff was a pension fund in Ohio. The complaint named Richard Faulkner, Graham Faulkner, and 4 board members individually. Graham was not named as an officer in the complaint. He was named as a related party whose appointment and actions precipitated the loss. His Columbia MBA, his 12 months at Weatherstream, and his LinkedIn post about day 1 of building the world's first AI-native reinsurance platform were all quoted in the filing. Verbatim. June. 2 senior members of Cornerstone's placement team resigned on the same Wednesday. They went to a mid-market carrier in Hartford, not to Pinnacle, not to me. They simply left because there was nothing left to place. The team that remained spent their days managing runoff inquiries and fielding calls from clients who had already terminated, asking for documentation transfers. The work of an ending. July. Richard Faulkner fired Graham. The board meeting lasted 90 minutes. Richard read a prepared statement that included the phrase, "a catastrophic failure of judgment," a phrase that, in reinsurance, carries a specific weight because catastrophe is not a metaphor in our business. It is the product. Richard was telling the board, in language they understood viscerally, that his nephew had destroyed the thing that the company existed to manage. Graham's departure was announced internally the same afternoon. He posted on LinkedIn that evening, something about a strategic transition and new opportunities in the insurtech space. The post received 14 comments. 2 were from former Cornerstone colleagues. One of those read simply, "Good luck, Graham." The period at the end carried more weight than anything in the post above it. Graham's Tesla lease ran another 22 months. His podcast went dormant in August. By September, his LinkedIn title read Advisor, with no company listed. The Columbia MBA ring presumably remained on his right hand. I wouldn't know. I never looked him up. September 2025. Cornerstone RA was acquired by a runoff specialist, a company whose entire business model is purchasing the carcasses of insurers and reinsurers that can no longer write new business and managing the slow bleed of existing claims until the book closes. The acquisition price was 23 cents on the dollar of Cornerstone's pre-crisis book value. 3 trade publications covered the deal. My name appeared in all 3 as context, not because I sought it, but because the story of Cornerstone's collapse was inseparable from the story of my departure. You cannot explain why a building fell without mentioning that someone removed the foundation. Richard Faulkner retained his equity stake in the surviving entity, diminished by 77%. He did not make a public statement. I heard from a broker who knew his assistant that Richard had begun playing golf 5 days a week. I did not call him. There was nothing left to say. The final numbers on Cornerstone, for the record, $4.7 billion in catastrophe aggregate limit, unplaced as of January 1st, 2025. 31 of 40 primary insurer clients terminated. 44% stock decline in a single session. 67% drop in ceded premium income across the first 2 quarters. Acquisition at 23 cents on the dollar, September 2025. A company that had been worth $3.8 billion reduced to salvage value because a 28-year-old with 12 months of experience decided that 14 years of trust was an inefficiency to be optimized away. Early March, Hamilton, Bermuda. I flew in the night before. The cab from the airport took the harbor road, and I could see the water even in the dark. A different darkness than Connecticut. Softer, the salt in the air carrying warmth instead of the metallic cold I'd been breathing for 4 months. I checked into a hotel on Front Street and slept 7 hours straight, which hadn't happened since November. The next morning, I drove to the Pinnacle Re office. It sits on a low rise above Hamilton Harbor, 3rd floor, windows facing the water. Trade winds were pushing small clouds east across a sky so blue it looked manufactured. The harbor was full. Container ships, ferries, a sailing yacht tacking toward dockyard. I left my jacket on the passenger seat. My name was on the door. A small brushed metal placard, the kind that costs nothing and means everything. Chief Treaty Officer. The letters were clean and precise, the same way I try to be. The laminated matrix was already on the wall. I'd mailed it ahead, wrapped in cardboard, with a note to facilities asking them to tape it above the monitor. They'd placed it exactly where I would have, eye level, slightly to the left, where I'd see it every time I looked up from a file. The pencil lines were faded. The laminate had been redone twice. The correlation framework still held. It had always held. The Gosling's black seal was in the bottom left drawer. I'd bought the bottle the day I signed the offer, walked into a liquor store on Reed Street, and picked it up the way you pick up a tool you know you'll need. I'd discovered Gosling's my first week in Bermuda for the interview, found it tasted like somewhere you could actually think. I didn't open it that morning. It was 7:30, and there was work to do. I stood at the window for a long moment. Hamilton Harbor, blue in a way Connecticut never is in March. A ferry was pulling away from the dock, its wake spreading in a white V across the surface. The air through the cracked window smelled like salt and engine diesel and something floral I couldn't name. Not Connecticut's flat gray brine, but something alive. I thought about what $2.9 billion in first-year premium production meant for the 28 clients who had followed me here. 28 of the 31 who left Cornerstone, each of them trusting that the coverage would be rebuilt because the person rebuilding it was the same person who'd built it the first time. I thought about what I owed them. I thought about the fact that my total compensation for the year, salary, signing package, production override, would reach $52 million, which was more money than I'd made in the previous decade combined, and which mattered less to me in that moment than the 28 files stacked on my desk, each one representing a promise I intended to keep. I didn't think about Cornerstone. I didn't think about Graham Faulkner or his dashboard or his podcast or his algorithmic capacity sourcing. I didn't think about Richard or the 14 calls I never returned or the fishbowl where I'd been fired 4 months earlier while rain drove against the glass. I sat down. I opened the first file. Philip Ashworth's syndicate terms were on top. A renewal quote submitted to my Pinnacle Re email address within 72 hours of the announcement. The numbers were clean. The capacity was there. The trust was intact, the way it had been intact for 14 years. Because trust isn't a system you can upgrade or a cost you can cut. It's a record, written in accuracy and kept in memory, and it goes where the person goes. I picked up my pen and began. They spent 12 months trying to automate what took 14 years to build. The catastrophe market has a long memory. It knows the difference between a model and the man who built it. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button and let me know what you think in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe and ring that notification bell to get alerts about new stories like this one. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.